Hi, Catherine. Thank you for having me today. My name is Jane Turville. I'm a filmmaker in Portland, Oregon, and I have been working on environmental issues for over 2 decades now. And in the early 2000s, I became involved with a program called The Natural Step. And The Natural Step was developed by a Swedish oncologist who wanted to know why so many of his clients in specific areas were more likely to develop some sort of a cancer. So this oncologist developed a 4-framework program called The Natural Step. And the frameworks consisted of environmental impacts under the terra firma, so mining, on the terra firma, industrial, farming, waste management, and in the atmosphere, pollution. The fourth one was society or social impacts, and that always ended up being green jobs. So there'd be these wonderful conferences about the natural step, and everyone would have wonderful strategies about the first 3 frameworks. But when it got to the fourth one, it all just melted down to economic development. In the later 2000s, child asthma started to creep in, but most people looked at that and said, that's not really a climate change issue. That is actually a pollution issue. And so let's fast forward now to 2017, and I had this opportunity to work with some teens from one of Portland's poorest communities on a climate change project. So I was excited, didn't quite know what was going to happen there, and so I met with students from Rosemary Anderson High School, and Rosemary Anderson is an alternative high school in East Portland that supports kids who have either dropped out and are trying to get back in school, or are at risk of dropping out, or just are not able to function successfully in a traditional school setting. So when I entered this project, I had no idea about the links between low-income communities and climate change. I didn't even know if there were any. And I especially didn't know, were there any that actually affected communities here in the Pacific Northwest? Kids didn't know either. And in fact, to be quite honest, the majority of them were there to kill a little time and pick up a credit. So what we did is we started telling each other stories, and they were stories about how weather had maybe impacted something that we wanted to do, or had allowed us to do something we wanted to do. And that's how our voice, our world, our future came to be. So the stories the kids told were surprisingly pretty personal and didn't expressly connect with climate change. Climate change actually for the first month or so wasn't really even mentioned that much. But it took hearing the stories and then stepping back and looking at the bigger picture, looking at the causes. And that was when we started to be able to see how climate change was affecting these kids and their families. So
my dad has a story. For his job at the time, he was just driving trucks, so he was just driving a semi-truck to deliver some food. He got stuck up when it was snowing, and he almost didn't make it back for Christmas. We were all very scared. Me and my brother and sister, we were also very young, so it was kind of weird not having him home for Christmas Eve, and it was definitely scary because it was dark up there, and he was stuck in the snow and didn't have anywhere to stay. So.
Taylor's family is like so many other families in Portland. They can't miss work because if they do, they lose a day's wages, and in order to pay for rent and food and all the stuff they need to just to get by, they've got to get every penny they can earn. And living paycheck to paycheck means nothing can go wrong, especially with your transportation. You can't risk sliding off the road in an ice storm or blowing out your radiator in intense heat. You can't pay for repairs or a tow truck. So for a lot of people, it's not really a choice. Regardless of who needs them at home, it's better to sleep in the car at work.
Taylor's story is about his dad having to sleep in his truck during a snowstorm. And that led to other stories that the kids told about their parents having to sleep in their car because they didn't want to risk damaging the car because of particularly ice and snow. So at first you're kind of like, what? I was, what? But what I learned through talking with these kids is that the financial limits that they and their families face dictate every decision and choice they have. And their choices are extremely limited. So, for example, with this staying in your car overnight, a car damaged because it slides off the road in an ice storm or has some sort of an accident or such, or can't deal with the snow, for us it might be an inconvenience and some cost. It's much more than an inconvenience for low-income families. There's no money to get it towed. There's no money to get it repaired, even if you can get it towed. There's no money to buy a bus ticket and get home if you have to leave your car on the side of the road. So you end up staying in your car, and that causes or exacerbates medical conditions or causes illness. And so then you can't go to work, or you can't take care of your family. And if that happens, you can't pay your bills or your rent. Also, you don't have a car anymore. You don't have transportation. You can't even get to work anyway. So when you look at the decision to sleep in your car at work rather than go home, it feels like the only really choice you have. Billy Joel has a song that he did early in his career called Angry Young Man. And there's a line in the lyrics that goes, just survival is the noble fight. For these kids and their families and the rest of their community, that lyric sums up their reality. So I learned many things about the links between living in poverty and climate change. And they're in the film, and I'm not going to go into them because I'd really like you to go watch the film. But I wanted to talk about two of probably the most profound things that I discovered for myself in this project. First of all, being able to think about climate change and other environmental issues is a luxury. For those of us lucky enough to have all of our basics for survival taken care of, we have the time and the capacity to address climate change, to think about it, to study about it, to debate about it. When you're poor, you don't. You don't have that luxury. The second thing is that just because you are poor does not mean you don't care, particularly about environmental issues like climate change. People understand at a level that something's going on, but they just don't have the time to actually address it. So, for instance, many of the kids that started the class dropped out, and they dropped out, several of them, because they had to go to work to help support their families. They had to take care of their siblings while their parents worked because there was no money for childcare. Lots and lots of reasons that mostly had to do with finances. And so, when that happened, I had friends that said, why don't you go over to X high school? They've got kids, a huge green club, and that club is doing wonderful things about climate change, and they're really charged up about it. And I think that's great. I think that's awesome. But what about the poor kids? The kids that don't have that luxury, that have to go take care of their siblings or go to work to help their families. I'm about giving the voice to the poor, especially around environmental issues. There's not a minute in their day that they have the luxury to sit back and look at big picture issues like I do. There are even scientific studies that show that the chronically poor, because of their financial situations, actually train their brains to always focus on cost first. And so while it's getting a little bit easier each year to draw the links between poverty and climate change, and there are significant links between them, we don't tend to look at them because they're not direct links. And we love direct links, don't we? They're easier to understand and explain. They're are very few variables, but indirect links take more time and they're much more complex. And so we just tend to avoid them. Poor communities and environmental issues tend to fall into that category. So going forward, I want to encourage all of you who are working on climate change and other environmental issues to go out into poor communities and listen. Just listen. Don't think you're taking out a solution or that you're going out there understanding the problem. I didn't know, you don't know. So listen. And then, because the poor don't have the luxury of examining the implications and these links, you do it. You do have that capacity, you have that interest, and you have that goal. So look at those links, understand and examine those links, and then take it back to the community, and take it to policymakers, and take it to people in the community, like the doctor and the county worker that you see in the film. What you'll find is that by broadening the community that you're working with to people outside of the environmental scope, you will find that you have a much bigger cohort than you ever realized, and that together you have a very strong voice for not only climate change, but also for the poor. I'd encourage you to do this, and you'll be really happy that you did. Thank you very much for your time today. Bye-bye.